Peer Review is a series of podcasts designed to shed light on the extraordinary breadth and diversity of talent that sit in the House of Lords. The House of Lords often gets a bad rap because it is thought to be a house of cronies and it is an unelected house. But I hope through these interviews you will see that there is this extraordinary talent, there is a great knowledge and experience, and with that I leave you to draw your own conclusions. Well, my guest today is Lord Chartres, Richard Chartres, unforgettable face of so many royal events. And lucky for me, he's a neighbour of mine in the country with his marvellous wife, Caroline. And actually, Richard, you're a very strong team.
Well, I mean, she's starring at the moment in the drama of our new 3 granddaughters. We have 3 granddaughters under 2.5. And although the parents are coping marvellously, Caroline proves to be the most fantastic grandmother.
I'm not surprised. But you were a bishop, you retired as a bishop, but you still keep the title bishop, don't you?
I am a bishop because being a bishop is indelible. It's not a job. I had various jobs during life, but I'm still a bishop. And that lasts until really the funeral. I mean, the Last Judgment, of course, we don't know about. But as a bishop, one's carried into church head first rather than feet first.
Unlike the rest of us.
That's right.
And where does that go back to?
The idea is that at the general resurrection, one's got to be in pole position to bless the congregation as they rise from their tombs. So that's why it's the other way around. And,
of course, the Lords has 32 bishops who could attend, and you do it in rotation, don't you?
Since this is about the House of Lords, I better say it's 26.
It's 26, is it? Yeah.
It's 3 by office, 5 by office. I'm wrong. 5 by office. Archbishops of Canterbury and York, London, Winchester and Durham, and then 21 others by order of their consecration, by order of their becoming bishop, unless you're a woman, where you're given preference until the numbers of men and women are equalised. So it's 26, and it's been like that since, well, there was an attempt to expel bishops from the House of Lords in 1645. It was one of those reforms which didn't really stick, and we've been there, actually, since the Middle Ages.
And these are Lord Spirituals, so I think you were a Lord Spiritual about over 20 years.
That's right, yeah.
And when you retired as Bishop of London, you were then made a peer, a crossbench peer, which is not normal necessarily. I mean, it is for a chosen few, and you're one of them.
Well, much to my astonishment, it's never happened before to a Bishop of London.
No.
But I was asked to become a Lord Temporal, and I sit on the crossbenches. But I have therefore been in the House of Lords since 1995, and have come to appreciate what isn't clear from public discussion, which is the very important fact that the big constitutional change in my lifetime has been when I was young and interested in politics. If there was an attempt to curtail discussion of legislative proposals in the Commons, the imposition of the so-called guillotine, it was front-page news. People were outraged. There was great debate about it. Now, in order to make the Commons family-friendly, every bill, virtually without exception, has attached to it a timetable motion, which is, in other words, a guillotine, which results in the fact, which will be an interest to any student of politics, that much legislation arrives in the House of Lords totally unscrutinised. The clauses have never been actually examined.
So, going back over your life, you were born in Hertfordshire, I think.
Yes.
And what sort of family?
Very good and hard-working parents who had no interest whatsoever in religion. My father used to call the clergy, semi-humorously, black-coated parasites, and they were very, very typical of a post-war generation. They both had very traumatic wars. I was born in 1947, so I suppose I was in many ways still under the shadow. My father's favourite brother, after whom I'm named, was intelligence officer in the 5th Royal Gurkha Rifles, and he was killed in Italy, a young student, 22. And it's one of the reasons why one of the best things that's happened to me recently is I've been asked to be honorary chaplain to the whole brigade of Gurkhas.
Oh,
as
great.
a sort of recognition of the fact that I'm already part of the family to some extent.
But of course, one of your relations, I think, was a member of Sinn Féin and was rumoured to be a bit of a gun runner.
No. We're not quite sure whose side he was on.
Right.
He was
quick to deny this.
he was part of the delegation which negotiated the peace treaty with Lloyd George, John Chartres, a kinsman, and that was the reason why I think he became the Free State's first ambassador to the Weimar Republic when the Free State was set up.
Oh, really?
So our family were Irish Huguenots.
I mean, going back to there was no evidence of religion in your family, but you went up to Trinity.
I went up to Trinity.
And you read theology.
History. No. Didn't touch theology.
Right.
At Trinity, I had a marvellous time there. And I read history. And one of the best things about life at the moment is I'm an honorary fellow. And Trinity taught me, well, a modicum about history, but a very great deal about getting on with people. And it was very kind to somebody who, like myself, because my brother was very severely mentally handicapped at a time when, astonishing as it seems now, people blame themselves for a child that was born handicapped. So he was only 18 months younger than myself, and after his birth, the blinds were drawn and the shutters went down. I went up to university not knowing that people had meals in other people's houses, or that people actually stayed with other people. There was one incident, I understand, a friend of my father's, while emigrating to Canada, came to stay when I was about 3, but he ate a box of dairy milk chocolate in bed, and he was the last person who was ever allowed to stay. So I went up to Cambridge.
A huge awakening.
Well, yes, it was a social education of most extraordinary and profound kind. Never having lived away from home at the time, I, of course, didn't know that there must be showers somewhere in New Court in Trinity. I tried for the first term or so to wash myself in the hand basin in my room, but fortunately I then saw a very distinguished octogenarian mathematics fellow naked and carrying a bottle of Polish vodka. And, my finely honed intellect went into operation. I said to myself, this man is heading for the shower. So I followed him with, total propriety, of course.
The tonic, probably.
And I found the shower and never looked back.
Yeah.
So it was a great social education.
And you made some great friends.
Oh, yeah, we just still have.
Which you still have, yeah.
Which I'm so grateful for. It's amazing.
So what point did religion come into your life then?
Well, I think it was at Trinity. I was confirmed at Trinity.
But that was a decision you made.
Yes.
And why did you make that decision?
Two things, I think. We didn't, as a family, go to church or really were very much interested in the subject. But there was two things. My brother, as I said, was very severely mentally handicapped. And almost my first memory is of people standing around his playpen where he wasn't playing. He was totally inert. He never could walk straight. He could never compose a sentence. But his life wasn't a tragedy. He loved music. He evoked love from people. And I think that a question which has always been real for me was formulated there. What's life all about? Is there any meaning if all the glittering prizes for which people compete are out of his reach from the very beginning? So what's it all about? So I think that question has stayed with me in various forms.
Mm-hmm.
The other thing is that I, like so many people early in life, I had numerous experiences of being out of the body, being having a sense of the vastness of the universe, and not in any romantic sense, but in a terrifying sense. Here am I, this little blob of consciousness in these vast spaces. And sometimes there was an extraordinary gift, a sense of wonder and ecstasy. So I think that the reason why...
When you say out of the body experience, what do you mean by that?
Well, I became no longer conscious of being rooted. Instead, I was out there with all this vastness. And I think when I got to university, I found some people in the chapel. Harry Williams, of course, was the dean. And the chaplain was a lovely man called Christopher Courtauld. And one of the strange things about my life is that he prepared me for confirmation, and ultimately I was his bishop.
How amazing. So I think I'm right in saying you became a priest in 73.
I think that's probably right, yes.
Yeah. And you went to, presumably, ecclesiastical college? Or...
Yes, I was a failed student. It's one of the best things about my CV. I went to the Liberal Catholic College of Cuddesdon near Oxford, and it became clear that I was out of sympathy with the way things were going. Because I was a convert. I actually thought the Church of England was rather a good thing. And the Book of Common Prayer, I thought, was astonishing and spoke to something very deep inside me. But, of course, everybody else, very often sons of the clergy, were bored with it all. And so they were constantly innovating and changing. So finally, halfway through the course, the vice principal was kind enough to say to me, "Chartres, I have to tell you that a man with your views has no future in the modern Church of England." And I interpreted that in a very straightforward way, and I left. And I became deputy headmaster of the International School in Seville, which was another extraordinary education. I'm still in touch with some of my erstwhile pupils whom I taught ancient history to A-level.
So that happened before 73, of course.
Yes, the failure.
Yeah.
I was a failed student at Cuddesdon, which is wonderful.
Yeah.
I wasn't expelled, unfortunately. That would even be better. But I was told that I had no future in the modern Church of England.
I think it's amazing.
And then I went back to training, and this time it was in Lincoln.
At Lincoln Cathedral? Or?
No, there's a theological college in those days,
right.
Subsequently closed next door to.
I don't know, how does it work in church? I mean, you caught the selector's eye in 92 when you became Bishop of Stepney. How does...
Well, I didn't
really... What's the process that...
Well, I didn't catch the selector's eye because in those days, things have changed very rapidly in the church. And appointments processes now involve many hours of psychometric testing.
Your favourite subject, I know.
My favourite subject.
Because you have a great impatience with bureaucracy.
And, all sorts of things, total transparency, great deal of form filling. In 1992, I had actually managed to revive a parish. This parish, actually, I was vicar of this parish. St. Stephen's, Rochester Road, just round the corner.
Yes, I know exactly. Yeah.
And it was in a rather sad state. It had a magnificent future behind it. There'd been some charismatic vicars in the 50s. And then, very sadly, it fell on hard times. And it had a large staff, and as soon as you sacked a curate, you lost touch with another 50 people, and so it went down and down and down and down. And by the time I arrived, there were 30 people in church on a Sunday, if we were lucky.
And so what was the formula of getting people back?
Promiscuous friendliness, really. Always wanting to say yes. And as soon as you said yes, because people were still interested in having their children christened, it's a populous parish, and we drew also from the other side of the road, from Vauxhall.
Was there a
Bridge
rectory
Estates.
attached to it, or?
Well, there was a 1950s horror in Vincent Square. There had been a marvellous Victorian Gothic vicarage, but my predecessor had it torn down and replaced with this extraordinary 50s thing, which he thought was the first flush of a new dawn. It actually was the stale fart of a future that failed, and it was terrible. But it was all of a piece. The morale was very, very low. But what you have to do, I think, is put yourself around, not spend too much time behind your desk, and penetrate this fascinating part of London. And if somebody says to you, will you do this? You say yes.
So you transform this area, and that's how you caught the selector's eye when the bishopric of Stepney came up, presumably.
Well, the selector was the Bishop of London.
Yeah.
There weren't selectors. And so he summoned me in one day.
Who was then Bishop of London?
David Hope.
Oh, yes, great man. Yeah.
He summoned me in one day and said, there are 2 vacancies at the moment, Willesden and Stepney. And although, as you can see, I'm irredeemably bourgeois, I was really deeply grateful the lot fell on Stepney. We had some gloriously happy years there.
But not many.
Not many,
You
because...
were only 3, because then you were...
Well, because
you
then
became Bishop of London.
The excellent Bishop of London, David Hope, went to York rather sooner than one expected. And so in those days, of course, there was no applying for jobs, thank goodness. Nowadays, you have to appear before a panel of 16 people and go through the various psychometric tests, etc. But then it was all very secret. And a letter arrived from the Prime Minister, John Major, saying, would you be prepared to do this?
Yeah, I'm not sure that my old headmaster was not in charge of the appointments. He was headmaster of Shrewsbury. So we owe him a great debt. And so, Richard, for 22 years, you were Bishop of London.
Yeah.
It's a curious one, being Bishop of London, because obviously it's not a residential area per se. The surrounding area is full of office blocks and city, or certainly was then.
Well, some of it is because we dealt with 3.5 million people north of the Thames, 18 boroughs. So it's
but they're all naturally going to their own churches in a way,
which are all in the diocese for which you're responsible as bishop.
Of course, you have that. And
I'm constantly visiting because the cathedral was St. Paul's Cathedral.
Yeah,
and we lived next door to that.
Yes, I remember.
But every weekend I was somewhere in the diocese, anywhere. So I saw a huge amount of a diverse.
And how often would there be a service every day in the cathedral?
Not in the cathedral, but
there was obviously in the diocese, yes.
A service daily. I obviously said the offices, which you're obliged to do, and it's a very important discipline. But there's something happening every day. I mean, you're running 600 churches, 1,000 priests, 153 schools. Mm. There are huge numbers of institutions. You are a sort of a mild community figure, and you're asked to hallmark and bless things like a new fleet of electric taxi cabs. And so, and one of the reasons why bishops in the House of Lords, people misunderstand it continually, because they say, oh, well, you're just there to defend the Church of England. In my experience, they don't do very much of that, perhaps too little. But what they are is they're in touch with a vast range of civil society organizations in every part of the country, and in some parts of the country which are rather underrepresented in the House of Lords, like Bishop of Truro, for instance, and not so many lords who make it up from Cornwall on a regular basis. So you are in touch with a huge variety of social institutions. There is, of course...
And, of course, in the city, you would have had... You're a liveryman yourself. You would have had to attend lots of livery events and...
Well, you have to ration your treats, Jonathan. You can't... the main job, really, was to build a community which had a sense of cohesion, a sense of purpose and direction. In 22 years, we didn't close a single church. We solved a massive financial problem. We started with £1 million a year deficit on the budget. And every year the General Secretary would say, I've got to put my hands in my hip pocket again, which, of course, meant the sale of another crucial piece of real estate. So we solved that. We balanced the budget for 10 years. We never closed a church. We built a new one in Tottenham. We reclaimed several churches from redundant churches' uses and doubled the paying membership, which you measure by the number of people who sign up in electoral rolls.
With that role comes the Dean of the Chapel role.
Yeah.
And you have been a key person at almost every royal event I can remember in recent times. A lot of them were obviously held at St. Paul's, but you did the address at Diana's memorial service in 2007. You confirmed Prince William. You made the sermon at...
I was actually her executor.
Yes, I know.
Which is even more.
Well, I want to come on to that in a minute. You gave the sermon at William and Kate's wedding.
Yeah.
You did the Margaret Thatcher funeral, which I had the pleasure of attending, and then even in retirement, you're still carrying the Queen's ring in the coronation.
Yes,
so
I know.
you've been inextricably linked with the royals through that. But going back to Princess Diana, I mean, you obviously knew her extremely well. How did that connection come about? Obviously, through being Dean of Chapel Royal, but how did you end up becoming an executor of her will?
Well, I think it was getting to know the family in the aftermath of the tragedy, and the two executors were her mother and one of her sisters, Sarah. And it became clear that it would be helpful to them and helpful to all sorts of other people involved if they could be joined by somebody else. And so I was appointed by the court to actually become a third executor. So I'm glad to say that although looking from the outside, someone may say, a bishop, a mother, a sister, is this a really high-powered body of executors? Actually, we did rather well. We increased the value of the estate, and we fought several smart engagements with the Inland Revenue. For instance, second-hand frocks are not that valuable, but of course, if it's been worn by a celebrity, what is the value? The only index the Inland Revenue was prepared to accept for establishing the value was the sale proceeds of Elvis Presley's wardrobe.
Of course, you are known as an academic and you have great knowledge and you're a great reader and fantastic library you've established over the years. One of the things that people probably don't know is you're an expert on the Turin Shroud.
Well, I wouldn't say I was an expert on the Turin Shroud. I mean, there were moments when you had to be clear that those who doubted the authenticity of the Turin Shroud were the fathers of the Church. Actually, there was an edict from Rome in the 1660s saying, well, it's a pious object, and no doubt it may stir you to piety, but this must not be confused with the actual veil. Now, that was what the church said. The popular enthusiasm for it began with photographic discoveries that there was something very odd about the negative when it was photographed. And so it was actually scientific credulity which led to the, I think, fantasy of the shroud. There were many such objects in medieval Europe. It just happens that very few others have survived. So I wouldn't really preen myself on being...
Well,
I'm a specialist generalist.
Well, maybe you are, but we, of course, first got to know each other with your great passion of green issues.
Yeah.
And you led the church on that very early on. You recognised the importance of it. I was obviously Minister of Energy and Climate Change, and that's why we sort of got to know each other. Are you satisfied with the way the church has gone in that regard?
No, because I think that one of the things that afflicts all institutions which have such a high degree of popular participation is a sort of wandering agenda. You pick up one thing and get interested in it, and you pick up another thing and another thing. I think that can afflict governments as well.
But you were very much behind getting the church into a zero carbon state.
Yeah, absolutely.
And that was you were the champion of that.
Well, they've made the statements, they've made the decisions, but making the decisions and having the rhetoric is very different from what you've got to do, it seems to me, in any position of leadership or in any governmental position, is to go on with a quite clearly defined, rather limited agenda. You go on and on and on about it, and when you have bored yourself silly, one of your chief stakeholders has heard the message for the first time.
And the other area, of course, where you've spent a lot of time is with the international Christian church. You've travelled a lot. You've created great relationships, particularly in Africa.
Well, one of the thrilling things of the most recent period is being a trustee of the Queen's Diamond Jubilee Appeal to bring an end to blindness caused by trachoma in the Commonwealth. And because of the Queen's name, we raised £100 million and operated with local health departments, Sight Savers International, Water Aid. And I went to see the work in Uganda, for example. It is astonishing that 80% of the vast numbers of people in the world who are blind for preventable causes. I mean, that's one of the most terrifying statistics I know. And this is one area in which we can make an enormous impact and have done so.
Yeah.
And, of course, it's particularly relevant to me because the health services in much of Africa in particular are run by the church, not our church only.
No. The future of the church, talking about Africa, with the increase in populations, of Christian populations outside of the United Kingdom.
Yeah.
I mean, the centre of gravity must be under threat in the same way that it would be under threat having the Commonwealth based in the UK. Do you see that round the corner?
Well, I mean, there are many more Anglicans in Nigeria than there are in England. Of course, that's the truth. We are a very small part of the global story. The much more significant part, I think, is the way in which religious sociology in South America first, and increasingly in Africa and Asia, is being reshaped by Holy Spirit movements of various kinds, Pentecostals. I mean, in Brazil, for instance, there's a block of senators, perhaps 70, in the Brazilian parliament who identify themselves as evangelical Christians. The sociology of the Christian church has changed profoundly in the last 20 years throughout the world. And I'm particularly, my particular responsibility is relations with the Orthodox So
Yes.
I've seen a lot of Eastern Europe and
Yeah.
and Russia, but also, as president of the Bible Society, I had business interests in China. That's where we print our Bibles.
Yes. Well, Richard, it's been fantastic talking to you, as always, and the Lord's is very lucky to have you continuing leading the way on with the Christian faith. Thank you very much indeed for sparing the time.
Well, thank you, Jonathan. I realised that we could have gone on much longer, but there we are.
We certainly could. Certainly could.